It is a gray, freezing morning in the middle of November, 1944, in the mud of the Lorraine region of eastern France, and inside a stalled column of American Sherman tanks, a young sergeant is refusing a direct order to leave the battlefield. His leg is a ruin. A German mine has torn it open to the bone, a wound so severe that the medics who reach him take one look and tell him plainly that he is done, that his war is over, that he needs to be evacuated to the rear immediately before he loses the leg or bleeds out. They offer him morphine for the pain. He refuses the morphine because he says it will dull his mind and he needs his mind clear. And then he refuses the evacuation too. He will not go. Instead, dragging that shattered leg, he pulls himself into another tank, takes command of it, and goes back to the front of the column to keep leading the advance, and he will keep leading it on that ruined leg for days. He is a tank commander named Ruben Rivers, and within a few days he will be dead, killed fighting his tank to the last to cover the retreat of the men around him. His own captain, who watched him do all of it, will believe with absolute certainty that Rivers earned the Medal of Honor, the highest award the United States can give, and will put him in for it. And then something will happen that is, in its own quiet way, as brutal as anything the Germans did that November. The recommendation will disappear, the medal will not come, and it will not come the next year, or the year after that, or in any of the decades that follow. Ruben Rivers and the entire battalion he fought and died in will be pushed to the edge of the story and very nearly erased from it. Not because of anything they failed to do, but because of the color of their skin. And it will take the United States more than half a century until nearly every man who could have received it in person is already in his grave to finally admit what it had known all along. If you are new here, stick around, because this is one of the most important stories in the whole war and one of the least told. It is the story of the Black Panthers, the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the first African-American armored units ever to fight for the United States, a battalion that Patton himself welcomed to his army, that fought for 183 days almost without pause, and that produced heroes the country then spent 50 years pretending it had not seen. But to understand why one of the bravest tank units in Patton's Third Army was nearly written out of history, you have to go back before the mud of Lorraine, back to an American army that was not sure it even wanted these men to fight, and to the long, humiliating road they had to travel just to be allowed to die for their country. To understand the 761st, you first have to understand the army it belonged to, because in 1944, the United States Army was rigidly segregated by race, from top to bottom, and it carried into the war a set of assumptions about black soldiers that seem almost unbelievable now. Black Americans served in large numbers, but they were kept in separate units, under a system that treated them as fundamentally lesser. And a widespread belief ran through the Army's leadership, stated openly in official studies and private conversations alike, that African American troops lacked the intelligence, the nerve, and the initiative for demanding combat roles, and were better suited to labor and supply duties well behind the fighting line. Driving trucks, loading ships, digging. The idea that black soldiers could be trusted with the complex, aggressive, split-second work of armored warfare, commanding tanks, maneuvering them in battle, leading men in the chaos of a tank fight, was, to much of the Army's establishment, close to unthinkable. And the men who volunteered anyway understood exactly the strange position they were in. They were being asked to cross an ocean and risk their lives for a country that, at home, denied them the vote in much of the South, barred them from restaurants and hotels and neighborhoods, and made them ride at the back of the bus. Many black Americans of that era spoke of fighting a war on two fronts at once, against the enemy abroad and against injustice at home, a double battle for a double victory. They were determined to prove, through their service, that the arguments used to keep them down were lies. Every black soldier who shipped out carried that weight in addition to his rifle, the knowledge that he was not only fighting the Germans, but fighting with his own conduct. 100 years of insult that said men like him could not measure up. It was an exhausting, unfair burden to lay on soldiers who already faced the ordinary terrors of combat. They carried it anyway, because they knew that how they fought would be used, back home, as evidence for or against the full humanity of their entire people. The 761st Tank Battalion was formed in the teeth of that prejudice. It was activated in 1942 and built up as one of the Army's African-American armored units. Its enlisted ranks filled with black soldiers, many of them commanded, in the fashion of the time, by white officers, though the unit also had black officers among it. The men trained in the American South, at camps in Louisiana, and then at Camp Hood in Texas. And their training was, in a sense, twice as hard as anyone else's, because they had to fight two enemies at once. There was the ordinary brutal difficulty of learning armored warfare, and there was the daily grinding hostility of a segregated South that treated them, in uniform, defending their country, as second-class citizens who were expected to step off the sidewalk. They endured insults, restrictions, and open contempt in the very country they were preparing to fight for. And they trained and trained and trained, kept stateside far longer than comparable white units, held back from combat year after year, as if the Army could not quite bring itself to turn them loose on the enemy. The training itself was a paradox. On the one hand, the men of the 761st became, by the time they finally went overseas, one of the best drilled armored units in the Army, precisely because they had been made to prepare for so much longer than white units did. Years of gunnery, maneuver, and tactics honed to a fine edge by the sheer accumulated hours. On the other hand, every day of that training took place inside the humiliation of the segregated South. The camps where they learned their trade were in states where they could be refused service in town, where German prisoners of war being held nearby were sometimes treated with more courtesy in local establishments than the black American soldiers guarding them. A bitterness that the men of that generation never forgot and never should have had to swallow. They were defending a country that would not let them eat at its lunch counters. They were mastering the machinery of modern war for a nation that doubted they could be trusted with it. That contradiction was the water they swam in every single day, and it forged in the battalion a particular kind of pride and determination, a resolve to be so good, so undeniable, that the doubters would have nothing left to say. One man stood at the head of them who deserves to be remembered alongside his soldiers. The battalion's commander was a white officer who had trained with these men, come to know them, and come to believe in them completely, and who, when the moment came, refused to be parted from them. He led them into combat rather than take a safer path, and he was badly wounded doing it, insisting on staying with his battalion. In an army built on the assumption that white and black could not truly serve as one, he had bound himself to his black soldiers as their leader and their advocate, and he bled for them. It was a small, real crack in the wall of segregation, made by a man who simply judged the soldiers in front of him by what they did rather than by what they were. One detail from those training days connects this battalion to a name almost every American knows, and it says everything about what these men faced. Among the officers of the 761st, before it went overseas, was a young lieutenant who would later become one of the most famous men in American history for something he did on a baseball field, Jackie Robinson. And Robinson never shipped out with the battalion to combat, because at Camp Hood, he was court-martialed. His offense was refusing to move to the back of a military bus when a driver ordered him to, an act of quiet defiance against the humiliating rules of segregation. He was ultimately acquitted, his conduct vindicated, but the episode kept him from deploying with his unit. Sit with that for a moment. One of the men from this very battalion was hauled before a court-martial during a world war for declining to give up a bus seat because of his race, the same indignity that, years later, would help ignite a movement. That was the America these soldiers wore the uniform of. That was what they were being asked to risk their lives to defend, even as it refused to fully count them as men. And there is a further layer to the Robinson episode that makes it almost unbearably pointed. The young lieutenant kept out of combat for refusing a bus driver's order would go on, only a few years later, to break the color barrier in American professional baseball, enduring a torrent of abuse to open a door that had been nailed shut, becoming in the process one of the most important figures in the entire history of the country's long struggle over race. The same steadiness and refusal to accept humiliation that got him court-martialed in a Texas Army camp was the very quality that would let him withstand what came at him later on the ball field. But in 1944, The Army could see none of that. It saw only a black officer who would not move to the back of a bus, and it put him on trial for it. The man the nation would one day celebrate as a hero of conscience was, in that moment, treated by his own military as a problem to be disciplined. If you want to understand, in a single image, the gap between what these soldiers were and what their country was willing to see, hold that one. A future American icon, in uniform, in wartime, hauled before a court because he would not accept an insult that the country itself would later be ashamed of. And then, at last, in the autumn of 1944, the 761st was sent to war. They crossed the ocean, landed in France, and were assigned to the 3rd United States Army, to George Patton. And here the story takes a turn that surprised the men themselves, because whatever else can be said about Patton, and we have spent time on his flaws, on the matter of these tankers he was, by the standards of his time and his army, remarkably direct. Patton wanted tanks. He wanted aggressive men who would drive them hard and kill Germans, and he did not much care about the packaging. When the 761st arrived, he did something that mattered enormously to men who had spent 2 years being told, in 100 small ways, that they did not belong. He came to meet them in person. He climbed up where they could all see him, and he spoke to them directly, in the blunt, profane, unmistakable style that was his alone. By the accounts that survive, he told them plainly that he had wanted good tankers, and that he had been assured they were good, and that he did not care what color a man was as long as he went up to the front and killed the enemy. He told them that the eyes of the whole world were on them, and, more pointedly, that the eyes of their own people back home were on them, that everyone would be watching to see whether black soldiers could fight, and that he was counting on them not to let anyone down. It was, by the racial standards of 1944, an extraordinary thing for a senior American general to stand up and say to a black unit, a public declaration that he judged them as soldiers and expected them to perform as soldiers. For men who had been told for 2 years that they were not wanted, being told by Patton himself that he had asked for good tankers and that they were the answer, was a thing they would remember for the rest of their lives. He had, in effect, demanded them, and now he expected them to prove him right. There is a complicated truth sitting inside that moment, and it is worth naming honestly. Patton was, in his private views and in the prejudices of his era, no crusader for racial equality. He was a man of his time and his class, with much of the ugliness that implies. And yet, standing in front of these tankers, what he offered them was something the rest of the Army had denied them for 2 years. He judged them by the only measure that mattered to him, which was whether they could fight. To a general who cared about exactly one thing, winning battles, a good tank crew was a good tank crew, and he was not going to waste a capable armored battalion because of the color of the men inside the tanks. In its own limited, blunt, self-interested way, that was a kind of respect these men had almost never been shown by the institution above them. He was not promising to change their country. He was promising to use them as soldiers, fully in the hardest fighting he had, and to men who had spent 2 years being kept on the shelf. That promise, from that general, meant everything. It also raised the stakes to an almost unbearable height, because now the most famous fighting general in the Army had publicly staked his own word on them, and the whole watching world had been told to judge an entire people by how these particular men performed under fire. They went into their first battle carrying that. They did. On the 7th and 8th of November 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion went into combat for the first time in the Lorraine campaign, and from that moment they essentially did not stop. They would go on to fight for 183 days, nearly 6 months of near-continuous combat, one of the longest sustained combat records of any American armored unit in the war. They fought through the mud and the flooded fields of Lorraine that autumn, cracking German defenses town by town. They fought through the terrible winter, playing their part in the wider battle to blunt and reverse the great German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the fighting the world remembers as the Battle of the Bulge. They battered their way against the fortifications of the German border defenses. They drove on into Germany itself, and by the end of the war, elements of the battalion had pushed deep into Central Europe, into Austria, linking up in the final days with the advancing Soviet forces coming from the east. Along the way, they were among the American units that helped liberate the prisoners of the Nazi camp system, coming face to face with the full horror of what the war had been about. That last fact deserves to be dwelt on because of the terrible symmetry in it. Here were men who had spent their whole lives and their entire military service being told by their own country that they were less than fully human, and they were among the soldiers who threw open the gates of camps built by a regime that had turned the idea of racial superiority into an industrial machine for murder. Black American tankers, second-class citizens at home, stood at the fences of the Nazi camps and looked at the ultimate endpoint of the belief that some human beings are worth less than others. It is impossible to know everything those men felt in that moment, but it is not hard to imagine that some of them understood, more sharply than almost anyone else in that army could, exactly what they had been fighting against, and exactly what the doctrine of racial hierarchy leads to when it is followed all the way down. They had crossed an ocean to help destroy, in its most extreme form, the very lie that oppressed them at home. Through the winter fighting in the Ardennes, the battalion helped hold and then push back the German tide, taking part in the grinding, frozen battles to relieve the pressure on the surrounded American forces and to break the last great German gamble in the West. Village after village, ridge after ridge, in snow and cold, as punishing as anything the war produced, the 761st did the hard, unglamorous work of an armored battalion in a winter campaign, and did it well, and did it at a cost, and they paid for all of it. The 761st took heavy casualties across those 183 days. Men killed, men wounded, tanks lost. Their white battalion commander, a man who had trained with them, believed in them, and refused to be separated from them, was himself badly wounded leading them and fought to stay with his men. This was not a unit kept safely in reserve to make a political point. It was a hard-fighting armored battalion that was thrown into some of the roughest combat on the Western Front, and that performed there as well as any unit in Patton's army. Exactly as Patton had demanded, and exactly as the doubters back home had insisted, they never could. They answered the question the whole country was supposedly asking: could black soldiers fight? And they answered it in blood over and over for 6 months. The tragedy is that the country, having gotten its answer, would then spend 50 years pretending it had never heard it. Which brings us back to Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. Rivers was from Oklahoma, one of many children in a family of modest means, a quiet, well-liked young man who had left a hard rural life for the Army. He was a tank commander in one of the battalion's companies, and by every account of the men who fought beside him, he was the kind of soldier a unit builds itself around: cool under fire, aggressive when it counted, and completely reliable. And in the middle of November 1944, in the fighting around a cluster of villages in Lorraine, Ruben Rivers did, over the course of a few days, the things that would, by any honest measure, earn him his country's highest honor. It began with a roadblock. As the battalion advanced, the American column was stopped cold by an enemy roadblock covered by German fire, the kind of obstacle that can hold up an entire attack and turn a stalled column into a target. Rivers did not wait for someone else to solve it. Under enemy fire, he climbed down out of the relative safety of his tank, went forward on foot to the obstacle, attached a cable to it, and hauled it out of the way so that the tanks behind him could push on. It was a cold-blooded act of courage performed in the open, exposed to the enemy, and it kept the whole advance moving. For that alone, he was awarded the Silver Star, a high decoration for valor. But that was only the beginning of what he did that week. A day or so later, Rivers' tank struck a mine, and the explosion tore his leg open in a horrific wound, gashed to the bone, the kind of injury that ends a soldier's fighting war on the spot. The medics wanted him gone. This is the moment from the cold open, and it is worth returning to now that you know who he was, because it tells you the measure of the man. He refused the morphine they offered him because he wanted to keep his head clear. He refused evacuation flatly, even as they told him he needed a hospital. And instead of leaving, he took over another tank and went right back to the head of the column and kept leading his men forward. For the next several days he fought on that mangled leg in constant pain, refusing again and again to be sent to the rear where he belonged, because he would not leave his men in the middle of a fight. His captain, who saw the wound and saw him refuse to quit, ordered him back more than once. Rivers would not go. Think about what those days actually required of him. This was not a single burst of adrenaline-fueled courage, the kind of thing a man does in one wild moment and could never repeat. This was sustained, deliberate, clear-headed bravery, chosen over and over, hour after hour, day after day, with a wound that any doctor would have called disabling. Every morning he woke to the pain of a leg torn to the bone and made the choice again, to stay, to command, to lead the advance, rather than accept the hospital bed he had more than earned. He had every honorable reason to go. No one would have thought less of him for accepting evacuation with a wound like that. It is precisely what the medical system existed to do. He refused it, not once, but repeatedly. And he refused the morphine that would have eased his suffering because he judged that a clear mind was worth more to his men than relief from his own pain. That is a rarer and harder thing than a single act of valor. It is the courage of a man who has decided that his responsibility to the soldiers around him outranks his own body, and who keeps deciding it, freshly, with full knowledge of the cost, every hour that he stays. It ended on the 19th of November, 1944, near a village called Gebling. The battalion was under heavy fire, and the situation had turned bad. The order came to pull back, and German anti-tank guns were positioned to tear the withdrawing Americans apart as they tried to disengage. The most dangerous moment in any fight, when a force turns to retreat and exposes itself. Ruben Rivers, still on his ruined leg, still refusing to leave, chose to do the thing that would save the other men and cost him everything. Rather than withdraw, he turned his tank toward the German guns and engaged them, drawing their fire onto himself, fighting it out with the enemy anti-tank guns to cover the retreat of his comrades. His tank was hit. Ruben Rivers was killed. He died fighting his tank to the last, with a wound that should have had him in a hospital bed days earlier, choosing the guns over his own safety so that other men could live. His company commander, a captain named David Williams, had no doubt whatsoever about what he had witnessed. He had seen Rivers clear the roadblock under fire, seen him refuse the morphine and the evacuation, seen him lead on a shattered leg for days, and seen him die facing the enemy guns to save the company. Williams put Ruben Rivers in for the Medal of Honor. By the standards applied to white soldiers for comparable deeds, it was an obvious deserving case. And then the recommendation went up the chain, and it vanished. No medal came. No explanation was given that made any sense. The paperwork for one of the clearest acts of valor in the battalion simply evaporated somewhere in the machinery of a segregated army. An army in which, as the plain and damning fact of the matter stood, not a single African-American serviceman would be awarded the Medal of Honor for the entire Second World War. Not one. Across a war in which more than 1 million black Americans served, in which men like Ruben Rivers performed deeds that would have brought a white soldier the highest honor without question, the number of medals of honor awarded to black servicemen at the time was 0. That is not a coincidence. That is a policy, whether anyone ever wrote it down or not. And the erasure did not stop at Rivers. The whole battalion suffered the same quiet fate. The 761st had fought for 183 days under Patton, taken heavy losses, and performed with distinction. And for decades afterward, the unit-level recognition that a record like that would normally command simply did not come. The formal citation honoring the battalion for its service was delayed not by a few years, but by more than 3 decades, finally granted long after the war, when many of the men who had earned it were old or already dead. The Black Panthers had come out fighting, exactly as their motto promised, and the country responded by looking the other way for a generation. But here is where the story, at long last, begins to turn, because the men who knew the truth would not let it stay buried. Captain David Williams, the officer who had recommended Rivers, never forgot and never let it go. For decades, for the rest of his long life, he carried the memory of Ruben Rivers and the injustice of that lost medal, and he pushed and wrote and argued and refused to let the case die. He was not the only one. The veterans of the 761st and their families, and the historians who eventually began to tell their story, kept the memory alive and kept pressing the question the Army had tried to make disappear. How was it possible that in the entire Second World War, Not one black American had done anything worthy of the Medal of Honor. Everyone who looked honestly at the record knew the answer. It had never been about deeds. It had always been about race. Finally, in the early 1990s, the United States Army did something it should have done half a century earlier. It commissioned a formal study to investigate whether racial discrimination had denied the Medal of Honor to deserving black soldiers of the Second World War. The study looked at the records, at the recommendations, at the pattern of denial, and it reached the conclusion that everyone honest had already known that, yes, racial prejudice had kept the nation's highest honor out of the hands of black servicemen who had earned it. The study identified a group of African American soldiers whose wartime valor merited the Medal of Honor and who had been passed over solely because of the color of their skin. And among the names on that list was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of the 761st Tank Battalion. And so, in January of 1997, more than 50 years after the war, the wrong was finally formally righted. In a ceremony at the White House, the President of the United States awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 African American veterans of the Second World War, the men the study had identified, correcting an injustice half a century old. It was a moment of real national reckoning, an official admission that the country had failed these men and was, at last, trying to make it right. But the timing carried its own heartbreak, and it is the heartbreak at the center of this whole story. Of those 7 men, only one was still alive to stand in that room and receive his medal in person. Only one. The other 6, including Ruben Rivers, had been dead for decades. The honor came for them posthumously, accepted on their behalf by family members who had waited a lifetime for their country to acknowledge what their fathers and brothers had done. Ruben Rivers' medal was accepted by his sister, who had carried the memory of her brother and the knowledge of his sacrifice through 50 years of silence, and who finally, in that room, saw him honored as he should have been honored in 1944. The one man of the 7 who lived to receive his own medal in person had waited just as long as the dead had. He was an infantryman who, like Rivers, had performed extraordinary feats of valor in the fighting and had been passed over for the same reason. And he had spent more than half a century as living proof of the injustice, a decorated combat veteran who knew every day of his long life that his country had withheld from him the honor his deeds had earned, and had done it because of his race. When he finally stood in the White House to receive the Medal of Honor as an old man, decades after the fact, he stood not only for himself, but for the 6 who had not lived to see it, and for the countless others whose cases were never even reviewed, whose valor is now beyond any hope of official recognition because the men who witnessed it and the men who performed it are all gone. His presence in that room was a mercy and an indictment at the same time, proof that recognition was possible, and proof of exactly how long the country had been willing to withhold it. 6 coffins and 1 old man. That was the arithmetic of a nation finally telling the truth 50 years too late. For the family of Ruben Rivers, the ceremony was the end of a very long road and the answer to a question they had lived with for 2 generations. The boy from Oklahoma who cleared the roadblock, refused the morphine, and died facing the German guns was, at last, formally and forever, a recipient of his nation's highest honor. His name now sits where it always should have sat, among the bravest of the brave. It simply took his country 50 years and the patience of a sister who never stopped believing to put it there. 50 years. That is how long it took. Ruben Rivers cleared that roadblock under fire, refused the morphine, led his men on a shattered leg, and died facing the German guns to save his comrades in November of 1944. And his country did not manage to say the words Medal of Honor over his name until 1997, by which time he had been in his grave for more than half a century and could not hear them. The courage was never in doubt. It was recorded at the time, by the men who saw it, in the recommendation his own captain wrote within days. The only thing that took 50 years was America's willingness to look at a black man's valor and call it what it was. So what do we do with a story like this? A story of magnificent courage and shameful neglect wrapped around each other. It would be easy to let the ending comfort us, to say that justice was done in the end, that the medal came and the record was corrected, and so the system worked. But that is too easy, and it dishonors the men to pretend otherwise. Justice delayed by 50 years is not justice fully served. Ruben Rivers never knew that his country recognized him. His mother, who buried a son, never knew. Most of the men of the 761st who fought beside him lived their whole lives with the knowledge that the Army had looked at their courage and decided it did not count. The medal in 1997 was real, and it mattered, and it was right. But it could not give Ruben Rivers back the recognition he was owed while he lived, and it could not undo the decades in which a whole battalion of brave men was pushed to the margin of the story they had bled to write. What the 761st actually proved in the end was something larger and harder than whether black soldiers could fight, because that was never a real question, only a prejudice dressed up as one. What they proved is that courage does not wait for permission and does not require recognition to be real. Ruben Rivers did not clear that roadblock or refuse that morphine or turn his tank toward those guns because he expected a medal. He did it because the men beside him needed it done, and he was the kind of man who did what needed doing, whatever it cost him. The medal, when it finally came, did not make him brave. He was already brave in 1944 in the mud of Lorraine, whether or not a single official in Washington ever admitted it. The 50-year delay is a stain on the country, not on the man. And the reason we tell this story now, all these years later, is to make sure that the second half, the erasure, the silence, the half-century wait, never quite succeeds. They tried to forget the Black Panthers. We are choosing to remember them. And as long as their story keeps being told and retold to people who never learned it in school, the forgetting does not get the last word. Now I want to hear from you because this one deserves your voices. Had you ever heard of the 761st Tank Battalion or of Ruben Rivers before today? Or is this the first time these men have crossed your path? Tell me in the comments, and if you have a family member who served in a segregated unit or who waited too long for recognition they had earned, tell me about them too, because that is exactly the memory this story exists to keep alive. If this told you something you did not know, and if you believe these men deserve to be remembered, do me the simple favor of hitting the like button. It genuinely helps carry their story to people who have never heard it, which is the whole point. And if you are not yet subscribed, you will want to be here for the next one, because we are going to follow a general into a place that changed him forever. The day Dwight Eisenhower walked into one of the Nazi camps and saw with his own eyes what the war had truly been about, and gave an order on the spot that he understood. Even then, history itself would one day depend on. Subscribe, so you are here when we tell it. Thanks for watching.